Is it corruption, failure in leadership, or decisions that push the country toward disaster? When a president fails, the whole nation pays the price, and history doesn't forget. In this video, we're diving into the worst presidents in American history. Each one earned a spot on this list for different reasons. Some ignored crisis, some allowed injustice to spread, and others got caught in scandals that shook the nation's trust. And here's the reward for sticking around until the end. You'll discover which president historians often agree was the single most disastrous leader the United States ever had. So let's begin our countdown. When we talk about the worst presidents, it's not just about popularity or whether people like them at the time. A president can be unpopular, but still lead wisely. On the other hand, a president can be loved in the moment, but leave behind chaos and mistakes that take generations to fix. So how do we measure failure at the very top office in America? To understand this, we need to set out a few clear criteria before we dive into the list itself. A bad leader is one who freezes, who avoids hard choices, or who makes decisions that worsen the situation. Take, for example, economic collapse, foreign threats, or a nation on the edge of civil war. In those moments, the country looks to the president for strength, vision, and action. When that leadership is absent, or worse, misguided, the result can be disastrous. History tends to remember those failures most clearly, because the consequences ripple out for decades. The second measure is corruption and misuse of power. The presidency is a position built on trust. People expect their leader to act in the nation's best interest, not for personal gain or to protect friends. When presidents surround themselves with corrupt officials, or when scandals take over their administration, it damages more than just their reputation. It shakes public faith in democracy itself. A corrupt president leaves citizens wondering if the government truly serves them, or if it only serves the powerful few behind closed doors. The third measure is the impact of policies on ordinary. Laws and executive actions can either lift people up or push them down. Some of the worst presidents introduced policies that deepened suffering, widened inequality, or limited freedoms. Others turned a blind eye to injustice, allowing harmful systems to grow stronger instead of fighting to dismantle them. Whether it's signing a law that expands slavery, ignoring a collapsing economy, or launching a war built on shaky evidence, the effects always fall hardest on everyday citizens. America was founded on ideas of freedom, even if the nation has struggled to live up to them. Presidents who actively worked against those ideals by upholding racism, silencing critics, or stripping away rights left scars that still shape the country today. It's not just about bad choices in the moment. It's about the lasting damage to the promise of democracy. When a leader turns against those basic values, it becomes clear why history places them among the worst. Now, here's something important to keep in mind. Being president is one of the hardest jobs in the world. But the difference lies in scale. Their stories remind us of how fragile leadership can be and how much power one person holds to shape or to shatter a nation's future. As we go through these examples, you'll notice something else. Not every bad president was bad for the same reason. Some were indecisive, some were corrupt, and some believed they were doing the right thing, but ended up steering the country into disaster. That variety is important because it shows there isn't just one way to fail as president. So when we say the worst presidents, we're not just throwing around insults. We're talking about leaders who, in moments of truth, chose wrong or chose nothing at all. And the cost of those choices wasn't measured in approval ratings or poll numbers. It was measured in lives lost, freedoms taken, and trust broken. That's the standard we'll use as we move forward. Crisis leadership, corruption, harmful policies, and betrayal of democratic values. Together, these are the marks of failure at the highest level. Now that we've set the stage, it's time to step into history and see which presidents fall into this category. Some names might surprise you. Others you may already expect. But all of them, in their own way, earn a place on the list of the worst presidents in American history. When we look back at the decades before the Civil War, America was like a house filling with smoke. The fire hadn't yet exploded, but everyone could smell it coming. The nation was divided between free states and slave states, and tension was rising with every passing year. In this dangerous moment, the country needed strong, steady leadership. Instead, it got two presidents whose actions, or lack of them, pushed the nation closer to collapse: Franklin Pierce and James Buchanan. Let's start with Franklin Pierce, who took office in 1853. Pierce was charming and likable, but charm doesn't run a country. He faced a divided nation and made one of the worst choices a president could make. He threw gasoline on the fire of slavery. His big mistake was the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. At first glance, the law seemed simple. It allowed settlers in those territories to vote on whether they would allow slavery. Pierce called it popular sovereignty, but in reality, it was a disaster. Instead of calming tensions, it unleashed violence. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers rushed into Kansas to swing the vote their way. What followed was years of bloodshed, known as Bleeding Kansas. Towns burned, families fled, and the nation saw that slavery could no longer be settled with compromise. Pierce didn't just fail to keep the peace. He openly supported pro-slavery forces, siding with the South at a time when the country desperately needed balance. By the end of his term, his own party abandoned him. But as bad as Pierce was, his successor, James Buchanan, is often ranked even lower, sometimes as the worst president in all of American history. Buchanan came into office in 1857, just 4 years before the Civil War. The nation was on the edge, and instead of stepping up, he stepped aside. His presidency became a story of paralysis. One of Buchanan's biggest failures was his reaction to the Dred Scott decision in 1857. The Supreme Court ruled that Black Americans, whether enslaved or free, could never be citizens. It also declared that Congress had no power to ban slavery in the territories. This ruling shocked the North and deepened the divide. Instead of calming tensions, Buchanan supported the decision. Worse, many historians believe he may have quietly pressured justices to rule in favor of the South. That choice sent a clear signal. Buchanan would not stand against the expansion of slavery. Things got even worse as the Southern states began to secede after Abraham Lincoln's election in 1860. He claimed the federal government had no power to stop states from leaving the Union. Imagine the President of the United States shrugging while the country fell apart. His inaction left Lincoln to inherit not just a divided nation, but a nation already at war with itself. Buchanan's critics call him weak, indecisive, and blind to the crisis around him. Even in his own time, many saw him as a man who refused to make hard choices. His defenders argue that the situation may have been impossible for anyone to control. But history is harsh. When the nation needed a leader to rise above politics, Buchanan stayed silent. That silence gave secessionists time and confidence to act. The cost of his failure was a bloody civil war that would claim more American lives than any other conflict. So, when we look at Pierce and Buchanan, we see two early failures, two men who sat in the Oval Office while the country marched toward disaster. Pierce lit the match in Kansas. Buchanan stood by as the fire spread. Together, they remind us of how dangerous, weak, or misguided leadership can be, especially in moments when the nation is already stretched to the breaking point. When Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in 1865, the nation was in shock. The Civil War had just ended, slavery was abolished, and the country faced the massive challenge of rebuilding. It was a fragile, hopeful moment. The Union had survived, but the question remained: how would America heal, and how would millions of freed slaves find their place in this new society? Into this moment stepped Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's vice president, who suddenly became president. Johnson came from humble beginnings in Tennessee. He liked to call himself a man of the people. But when it came time to lead, his vision for the country clashed with the progress so many had fought and died. Instead of carrying out Lincoln's plans for unity and equality, Johnson became an obstacle to Reconstruction. His biggest failure was his attitude toward the South. Johnson believed in quick forgiveness for the former Confederate states. He wanted them brought back into the Union with almost no punishment and very few conditions. Within months, he allowed many of the same Confederate leaders to return to power. Imagine losing a bloody 4-year war and then seeing the same people who led the rebellion back in charge of state governments. That's exactly what Johnson allowed. Even worse, Johnson had no real interest in protecting the rights of newly freed Black Americans. He opposed giving them the right to vote, and he rejected almost every effort to guarantee their safety or equality. Southern states quickly passed black codes, laws designed to keep freedmen in a state of oppression, restricting where they could live, work, or travel. When Congress tried to push forward with stronger protections, Johnson stood in the way. He vetoed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which aimed to give Black Americans equal protection under the law. He also vetoed bills to extend the Freedmen's Bureau, which provided food, housing, and education to former slaves. Time after time, Congress passed measures to secure equality, and time after time, Johnson tried to block them. Fortunately, Congress often overrode his vetoes, but the message was clear: the President of the United States was not on the side of freedom. This clash between Johnson and Congress grew so bitter that it led to one of the most dramatic moments in American political history: impeachment. In 1868, the House of Representatives voted to impeach Johnson, accusing him of abusing his power and undermining Reconstruction. He survived removal from office by a single vote in the Senate. That narrow escape kept him in office, but it cemented his place in history as one of the most ineffective and divisive leaders ever to sit in the White House. His resistance gave white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan more room to grow. Violence and intimidation spread across the South, targeting freedmen and anyone who supported equal rights. The promise of true freedom and equality after the Civil War was delayed for generations, and much of that delay can be traced back to Johnson's refusal to lead with courage and vision. Historians often rank Andrew Johnson near the bottom of every list of presidents, and for good reason. He was handed one of the greatest opportunities in American history, the chance to guide the nation into a new era of equality and unity. Instead, he squandered it. He restored power to those who had tried to destroy the Union, and he stood in the way of progress for the very people who most needed protection. In a moment when the nation needed healing, he deepened the wounds. And in a time when freedom was finally within reach for millions, he tried to hold it back. That legacy makes him one of the worst presidents in American history. When leaders place loyalty to friends above loyalty to the country, scandals follow, and trust in government collapses. Two presidents, Warren G. Grant, are remembered less for what they accomplished and more for the shady deals, greedy allies, and constant scandals that haunted their time in office. Let's begin with Warren G. But beneath that calm image, his presidency was a storm of corruption. Harding had a habit of surrounding himself with close friends and political allies, many of whom were unqualified and dishonest. They became known as the Ohio Gang, and their misdeeds would soon tarnish his name forever. Harding's Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, secretly leased government oil reserves in Wyoming and California to private companies. In return, Fall received massive bribes in cash, loans, and even cattle. When the scandal broke, it shocked the nation. And that wasn't the only scandal. The Veterans Bureau, which was supposed to help returning soldiers, was caught stealing millions of dollars meant for medical supplies and hospitals. Harding's associates were constantly being investigated, and many ended up in jail. Historians often say Harding himself may not have been deeply corrupt, But his weakness as a leader, his inability to control the people around him, made him responsible. He trusted the wrong men, and the country paid the price. Harding died suddenly in 1923, before most of the scandals came alight, but his presidency is remembered as one of the most corrupt in American history. Now let's turn to Ulysses S. Grant, the famous Union general who won the Civil War. Grant was a national hero, admired for his courage and determination on the battle. But when he became president in 1869, he faced a very different kind of fight: politics. And in politics, Grant's greatest flaw was his loyalty. He trusted his friends absolutely, even when they didn't deserve it. That trust opened the door to wave after wave of corruption. A group of government officials and whiskey distillers conspired to avoid paying taxes on liquor. They cheated the government out of millions of dollars, and when the scheme was uncovered, it turned out that some of Grant's closest allies were involved. To make matters worse, Grant defended his personal secretary, who was implicated in the scandal, long after it was clear the man was guilty. Another major scandal was the Credit Mobilier affair, in which officials were caught taking bribes and using insider deals tied to the building of the Union Pacific Railroad. Although this scandal started before Grant's presidency, it blew up during his time in office and added to the impression that corruption was everywhere in Washington. Grant himself was not corrupt. Most historians agree he was honest and well-meaning. His failure to control corruption within his administration damaged his presidency and weakened trust in the government. When we put Harding and Grant side by side, we see two men undone by the same weakness: a blind loyalty to friends and allies. Grant's devotion to his inner circle shielded corruption from punishment. Neither man fully grasped the importance of keeping their administrations clean. So, while Harding promised normalcy and Grant delivered victory on the battlefield, both failed in the White House. They remind us that being president is not just about leading. It's about choosing the right people to lead. When a president cannot control corruption, the legacy of their administration becomes a cautionary tale. That is why both Harding and Grant are often ranked among the worst presidents in American history. When money dries up, banks close, and families go hungry, people look to the president for answers. A strong leader can ease the pain and restore confidence. But when the president fails to act or makes the wrong choices, the suffering only deepens. Two presidents, Martin Van Buren and Herbert Hoover, stand out as leaders whose names became tied to economic failure. Let's start with Martin Van Buren, who took office in 1837. Van Buren had been a skilled politician, a master at building alliances and running campaigns. But skill in politics did not prepare him for an economic disaster. Just a few months after he became president, the country plunged into one of the worst depressions of the 19th century, the Panic of 1837. Thousands of people lost their savings almost overnight. Farms were foreclosed, trade slowed, and entire communities were thrown into poverty. But Van Buren's response was widely seen as weak and ineffective. He argued that the federal government should not interfere too much in the economy. So while people begged for relief, Van Buren offered little more than patience. He created an independent treasury to manage federal funds, but it did nothing to ease the pain of ordinary citizens. The Depression dragged on for years, and Van Buren's reputation sank with it. People called him Martin Van Ruin, a nickname that followed him long after he left office. Nearly a century later, another president would face an even greater collapse: Herbert Hoover. People thought he would be the perfect leader to handle any crisis. But just months into his presidency, the stock market crashed, and the country spiraled into the Great Depression. At first, Hoover believed the downturn was temporary. He urged businesses not to cut wages and encouraged people to stay optimistic. But as the Depression grew worse, optimism wasn't enough. Banks failed, factories closed, and unemployment soared to nearly 25%. Breadlines stretched through city streets, and families built makeshift shacks in camps that became known as Hoovervilles, a cruel reminder that the president's name had become linked with poverty and despair. Hoover did take some action, but most of it came too late and was too small. He approved public works projects like the Hoover Dam and created the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to lend money to banks and businesses. But ordinary people saw little relief. Hoover resisted direct federal aid to families, believing that charity should come from local communities, not Washington. His faith in self-reliance and limited government blinded him to the scale of the disaster. The breaking point came in 1932, when thousands of World War I veterans marched to Washington, demanding early payment of their service bonuses. They were desperate, unemployed, and hungry. Instead of negotiating, Hoover ordered the military to drive them out. Soldiers used tear gas and even tanks to clear the camps, burning the shelters the veterans had built. The images shocked the nation and destroyed what little trust Hoover still had. By the time Hoover left office in 1933, the country was in ruins and people were eager for new leadership. Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal would soon redefine the role of government in fighting economic crisis, but Hoover's failures ensured that his presidency would always be remembered as one of the darkest in economic history. When we put Van Buren and Hoover side by side, the pattern is clear. Both men faced massive financial crises. Both clung to the belief that government should do little to interfere. And both watched as ordinary Americans suffered while they defended principles of limited government. Their names became symbols of ruin, and history judges them harshly for failing to meet the moment. So while Van Buren inherited a panic and Hoover was caught off guard by a crash, their weak responses left the country to struggle on its own. In times of crisis, people remember not what presidents believed, but what they did. And in the cases of Van Buren and Hoover, what they did was simply not. Presidents are judged not only by how they handle wars and crises, but also by how they treat the rights of their freedom of speech, civil liberties, and equality under the law are supposed to be at the heart of American democracy. But history shows us that even presidents who claim to protect liberty sometimes turned against it. Two names that often come up in this debate are Woodrow Wilson and George W. Bush, leaders who, in very different times, pushed policies that raised serious questions about freedom in America. Let's begin with Woodrow Wilson, who took office in 1913. Wilson was an academic, a former college president, and he liked to present himself as a man of principle. But at home, his presidency told a different story, one of suppression, division, and racism. Wilson believed strongly in centralized power, and when America entered World War I, he cracked down on dissent in a way no president had. His administration passed the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918. Newspapers were shut down, activists were jailed, and ordinary citizens were silenced for speaking out. Debs was sentenced to 10 years in prison for giving a speech against the war. Free speech, one of the most basic American rights, was crushed under Wilson's watch. At the same time, Wilson openly supported segregation. He allowed federal offices to be resegregated, pushing Black Americans out of government jobs. He defended racist policies, and his administration set back racial progress in ways that lasted for decades. To make matters worse, Wilson even praised the film The Birth of a Nation, a movie that glorified the Ku Klux Klan and spread hateful stereotypes. For a president who claimed to fight for democracy abroad, his actions at home told a very different story. Now let's fast forward to the 21st century and the presidency of George W. Bush. Bush entered office in 2001, and just months later, the September 11 terrorist attacks shook the nation. It was one of the darkest days in American history, and in the aftermath, Bush promised to protect the country at all costs. His leadership in those first days won him support, but the policies that followed sparked fierce debate over civil liberties. In 2001, Congress passed the Patriot Act, giving the government sweeping new powers to monitor communications, track financial transactions, and detain suspects. The goal was to prevent terrorism, but many argued that the act went too far. Americans worried about warrantless wiretaps, secret surveillance programs, and the erosion of privacy rights. Suddenly, phone calls, emails, and even library records could be tracked in the name of national security. Bush also launched the War on Terror, including the invasion of Iraq in 2003. The war was based on claims that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, claims that were never proven. As the war dragged on and no weapons were found, critics accused Bush of misleading the nation and sacrificing American lives on false grounds. At the same time, the treatment of prisoners in places like Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay raised serious questions about torture, human rights, and America's moral standing in the world. Supporters of Bush argued that he did what was necessary to keep America safe. And it's true that no major terrorist attacks on the scale of 9/11 happened again during his presidency. But the cost was high. Many felt that freedoms were eroded, trust in government was shaken, and the Middle East was destabilized in ways that are still felt today. When we compare Wilson and Bush, the parallels are striking. Wilson used wartime fear to silence critics. Bush used fear of terrorism to expand surveillance and limit privacy. Both believed they were protecting the nation. Both left behind legacies of overreach that made Americans question how much freedom they were willing to trade for security. The lesson here is clear. Protecting a nation is about more than winning wars or passing tough laws. It's about holding onto the values that define democracy, even in times of fear. Wilson and Bush remind us that when presidents put security above liberty, the nation always pays a price. What makes a president truly bad? As we've seen, there isn't just one answer. Some failed in times of crisis, like Herbert Hoover and Martin Van Buren, who watched as economic collapse devastated millions. Some opened the door to corruption, like Warren G. Harding and Ulysses S. And then there was Andrew Johnson, who inherited a moment of hope after the Civil War and squandered it by siding with those who opposed equality. Even presidents who seemed strong on the world stage, like Woodrow Wilson and George W. Bush, made decisions that restricted freedoms at home and left behind long shadows of controversy. Each of these men held the highest office in the land, and each had the chance to guide America forward. Instead, their choices weakened trust, deepened division, or set the nation on a dangerous path. What ties them together isn't just that they failed, it's how much their failures cost ordinary. When a president mishandles the economy, it's workers and families who suffer. When a president tolerates corruption, it's citizens who lose faith in government. When a president ignores injustice, it's entire communities who are left vulnerable. And when a president overreaches in the name of power or security, it's the freedoms of everyday Americans that disappear. But here's the most important point. History remembers. The worst presidents are remembered because their errors weren't small. They were massive, unavoidable, and often irreversible. They made choices that changed the course of the nation in ways that still echo today. Think about Buchanan's refusal to confront secession. That failure didn't just tarnish his reputation. It helped set the stage for a bloody civil war that claimed more American lives than any other continent. Think about Andrew Johnson's resistance to Reconstruction. His refusal to protect freedmen delayed the promise of equality for generations. Or consider Herbert Hoover's slow response to the Great Depression, which left families hungry and desperate, paving the way for an entirely new vision of government under Franklin Roosevelt. They are legacies of failure that shaped the United States itself. And that's why historians, scholars, and citizens continue to debate and rank these men at the bottom of presidential history. Leadership matters. The presidency isn't just about power, it's about responsibility. It's about seeing beyond personal interests, beyond party loyalty, and beyond the immediate moment. The worst presidents remind us of what happens when leaders fail to rise to that responsibility. They show us how fragile democracy can be, how quickly trust can erode, and how deeply wrong decisions can scar a nation. For every failed president, there have been leaders who rose to the occasion, who fought for justice, and who pushed the nation forward even in the hardest times. The failures of the worst presidents stand as warnings, but they also highlight the importance of demanding better. They remind us why citizens must hold leaders accountable, why democracy requires vigilance, and why history never forgets. So as we look back on Pierce, Buchanan, Johnson, Harding, Grant, Hoover, Van Buren, Wilson, and Bush, we're not just making a list of failures. Their mistakes are etched into the story of America. And the cost of that failure is carried not by the presidents themselves, but by the people they were meant to serve. The lesson here is clear. Protecting a nation is about more than winning wars or passing tough laws. It's about holding on to the values that define democracy, even in times of fear. Wilson and Bush remind us that when presidents put security above liberty, the nation always pays a price. What makes a president truly bad? As we've seen, there isn't just one answer. Some failed in times of crisis, like Herbert Hoover and Martin Van Buren, who watched as economic collapse devastated millions. Some opened the door to corruption, like Warren G. Harding and Ulysses S. Harding and Ulysses S. Grant, whose blind loyalty to friends allowed scandals to consume their administrations. And then there was Andrew Johnson, who inherited a moment of hope after the Civil War and squandered it by siding with those who opposed equality. Even presidents who seemed strong on the world stage, like Woodrow Wilson and George W. Bush, made decisions that restricted freedoms at home and left behind long shadows of controversy. Each of these men held the highest office in the land, and each had the chance to guide America forward. Instead, their choices weakened trust, deepened division, or set the nation on a dangerous path. What ties them together isn't just that they failed, it's how much their failures cost ordinary. When a president mishandles the economy, it's workers and families who suffer. When a president tolerates corruption, it's citizens who lose faith in government. When a president ignores injustice, it's entire communities who are left vulnerable. And when a president overreaches in the name of power or security, it's the freedoms of everyday Americans that disappear. But here's the most important point. History remembers. But here's the most important point. History remembers. The worst presidents are remembered because their errors weren't small. They were massive, unavoidable, and often irreversible. They made choices that changed the course of the nation in ways that still echo today. Think about Buchanan's refusal to confront secession. That failure didn't just tarnish his reputation. It helped set the stage for a bloody civil war that claimed more American lives than any other continent. Think about Andrew Johnson's resistance to Reconstruction. His refusal to protect freedmen delayed the promise of equality for generations. Or consider Herbert Hoover's slow response to the Great Depression, which left families hungry and desperate, paving the way for an entirely new vision of government under Franklin Roosevelt. Or consider Herbert Hoover's slow response to the Great Depression, which left families hungry and desperate, paving the way for an entirely new vision of government under Franklin Roosevelt. They are legacies of failure that shaped the United States itself. And that's why historians, scholars, and citizens continue to debate and rank these men at the bottom of presidential history. And that's why historians, scholars, and citizens continue to debate and rank these men at the bottom of presidential history. Leadership matters. The presidency isn't just about power, it's about responsibility. It's about seeing beyond personal interests, beyond party loyalty, and beyond the immediate moment. The worst presidents remind us of what happens when leaders fail to rise to that responsibility. They show us how fragile democracy can be, how quickly trust can erode, and how deeply wrong decisions can scar a nation. They show us how fragile democracy can be, how quickly trust can erode, and how deeply wrong decisions can scar a nation. For every failed president, there have been leaders who rose to the occasion, who fought for justice, and who pushed the nation forward even in the hardest times. The failures of the worst presidents stand as warnings, but they also highlight the importance of demanding better. They remind us why citizens must hold leaders accountable, why democracy requires vigilance, and why history never forgets. So as we look back on Pierce, Buchanan, Johnson, Harding, Grant, Hoover, Van Buren, Wilson, and Bush, we're not just making a list of failures. So as we look back on Pierce, Buchanan, Johnson, Harding, Grant, Hoover, Van Buren, Wilson, and Bush, we're not just making a list of failures. We're drawing a map of what not to do, a reminder of how much is at stake when one person holds the power of the president. Their mistakes are etched into the story of America. Their mistakes are etched into the story of America. And the cost of that failure is carried not by the presidents themselves, but by the people they were meant to serve. And the cost of that failure is carried not by the presidents themselves, but by the people they were meant to serve.